Have you ever turned on an old black and white movie and thought, where's the violence, the sex? Don't these people ever swear?
I'm going to give the estate away to the Salvation Army, and I knew goddamn well I was going to say it.
To see him, for Christ's sake, he's up there. What the hell do you want from me?
The goddamn match won't strike.
Okay, some actors did swear like sailors, just not on screen, but there's a reason for that. Throughout the 1920s and early 30s, Hollywood studios began embracing what became known as the Motion Picture Production Code, which would become a set of rules that state what cannot be shown on screen. The reason that the code, this form of self-censorship, was considered by studio owners at the time was due to a number of high-profile actors and directors who were publicly linked to drug use and murder in the early to mid-1920s. The most sensational scandal involved Fatty Arbuckle, one of silent movies' biggest stars. The heads of the largest studios at the time formed the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. The purpose of this group was to clean up their industry's image and protect the financial position of the studios. This move is similar to what Major League Baseball did just 2 years prior in 1920 after a scandal during the 1919 World Series, where 8 members of the Chicago White Sox were accused of purposefully losing the series in exchange for gambling winnings. The scandal caused many spectators to question the validity of the league's games and threatened baseball's claim as America's favorite pastime. The MLB quickly hired a federal judge as their first league commissioner, who banned the accused players and cracked down on conflicts of interest among the league's owners, quickly earning back the public's trust in the sport. Hollywood hired Will Hayes. A former RNC chairman and then postmaster general in the Warren Harding administration, Hayes was hired by the MPPDA to polish up Hollywood's image, with producers fearing that if their industry appeared morally barren, the public would abandon the movies. It would take the rest of the decade before the strictures put in place would become the Motion Picture Production Code. Despite his prior career in politics, Will Hayes would forever be associated with his work in Hollywood, as the production code would forever be known as the Hayes Code. Will Hayes left Washington, D.C. and got to work in Hollywood in 1922, hoping to restore an image of decency in the industry, mainly by way of cleaning up and wiping out objectionable content in movies. What could be considered objectionable was left entirely up to Hayes. In 1924, he came up with what he called the Formula, which was a loose set of guidelines urging filmmakers to avoid portraying things like sex, violence, and law-breaking in films. Studios were left to ensure these taboos didn't make it to the screen in their own films, but few filmmakers were interested in being told what could and couldn't be included on screen. With film attendance reaching all-time highs in the mid-1920s without any cleansing of on-screen material, studio bosses had little motivation to start censoring what the public obviously craved. In 1927, Hayes revamped the formula by working directly with studio heads to produce a document eloquently called The Don'ts and the Be Carefuls. This list tried to ban the depiction of sexually suggestive images, drug use and trafficking, and the use of 4-letter words, as sound was just being introduced to the movies. The don'ts and the be carefuls were still unenforceable by Hayes, as studio bosses became desperate to keep audiences coming back to theaters after the stock market crash of 1929, ruling out nothing that might get people into the seats of movie houses they owned and operated. By 1929, Catholic officials who were close to Will Hayes urged the creation of a more stringent and enforceable code of rules for the industry, threatening to encourage their followers to boycott movies that didn't meet their standards. A priest named Daniel Lord, who had served as a consulting producer in Hollywood on films such as Cecil B. DeMille's King of Kings, wrote such a document with the church's standard of morality in mind. This document was the Motion Picture Production Code. When presented to Hayes, he said of it, quote, "This is the very thing I've been looking for." So what is the production code? The code begins with 3 main principles about the standards presented on screen. It then breaks those 3 principles down into 12 sections to highlight specific ways those principles should not be violated, such as portraying criminals in a sympathetic light, besmirching the sanctity of marriage, and using vulgarities and double entendres.
Haven't you ever met a man that can make you happy?
Sure. Lots of times.
Unlike Hayes' formula and the don'ts and the be carefuls, the MPPDA officially endorsed the code and adopted it in 1930. Despite this, studios initially treated it no differently than the documents that came before it. It's this time from 1930 through mid-1934 that is often referred to as the pre-code era, since, despite the adoption of the code, movies continued to be made in its violation. Despite the economic downturn caused by the Great Depression, going to the movies was still popular and affordable during this period, and movies that pushed the boundaries of decency were popular with movie-going crowds. The gangster genre exploded during the pre-code era as audiences ate up the rags-to-riches stories that glorified the life of the gangster, many of which mirrored real-life headlines of criminals like Al Capone, who enjoyed an unbelievable amount of notoriety during the late 1920s. Censorship offices around the country ramped up censoring of films at state and local levels. This was made possible by a 1915 Supreme Court decision that ruled First Amendment protections didn't extend to motion pictures. This meant that an audience watching a controversial film, like Mae West's I'm No Angel, in Pennsylvania, could see a completely different cut than audiences in Kansas. Press in areas with rampant censorship often touted those cuts, urging audiences to stay away. A gathering resistance to their product and their profits was what finally motivated studio bosses to implement change in their output. In 1934, the MPPDA amended the code to require a stamp of approval from the group's newly formed Production Code Administration to be exhibited into theaters. This change went into effect July 1st, 1934. The Production Code Administration was headed by Joseph Breen, the first person to successfully implement restrictions on content in the movies. Breen landed a job in Hayes' office at the end of 1932 after years working behind the scenes with Catholic officials and conservative Hollywood insiders to ratchet up pressure on Hayes after his attempts at censorship were rendered ineffective. As head of the PCA, Breen oversaw the process to weed out objectionable films and, if possible, entire projects before they were ever filmed. Treatments and screenplays were submitted to the office, along with the original works if the film was being based off an existing book or play. The PCA then highlighted scenes, themes, or entire characters who wouldn't pass the censors, giving the studios an idea if a script would be filmable or if they should abandon certain stories before spending additional money. The PCA then screened every finished film and either demanded cuts or granted it a stamp of approval. The rule that films needed code approval to show in theaters not only applied to new productions, but any film made before July of 1934 that sought re-release into theaters had to obtain approval through the same process. The PCA wasn't the only organization demanding changes to the movies. The Catholic Legion of Decency formed in 1934, leading the charge among religious and other social groups in the country to oppose what they saw as the continuing degradation of morality in Hollywood films. The Legion issued its own rating system based on a film's morality, forbidding any of its members from seeing movies that earned its harshest rating, a C, for condemned. The number of Catholics in America at the time was large enough that studio heads heeded to pressure from the Legion of Decency, avoiding a condemned rating at all costs. High-profile producers and directors were forced by studio bosses to make edits to their films throughout the code era after being threatened with a condemned rating, even if their film had already been code-approved. It can be argued that Joseph Breen had more say in the final output of motion pictures than any one person in history, using the code he helped bring into existence to sanitize the stories that audiences could consume, though he would find out quickly that enforcing the code as written was easier said than done. Despite finally having autonomy to enforce the production code, Breen and the PCA began making exceptions to their own rules almost immediately. One of the most high-profile cases, though not the first, came in the form of Gone with the Wind. After much back and forth with the film's producer David O. Selznick, Breen allowed some of the racier elements of the book to make it to screen, including the use of a banned curse word, which would become part of one of the most famous movie quotes of all time.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Once a concession was made by the PCA, other writers, directors, and producers would cite them in their own meetings with the PCA when arguing for their own exceptions. And by the late 1940s, flexibility of the code became almost mandatory as more foreign films began showing in America without code approval. Independent studios began popping up around this time as well, and weren't afraid of releasing films without approval, since an amendment was passed in the mid-1940s that removed the financial penalty on theaters for doing such. By the 1950s, Breen realized the strictures of the code as written were no longer fully enforceable and began making larger exceptions. In the case of Elia Kazan's A Streetcar Named Desire, Kazan worked directly with Breen to earn code approval for his film that was being promoted as strictly for adults, as it revolved around sexual tension between its characters. Only after the film was approved did the Legion of Decency condemn it, and Warner Brothers further edited the film against Kazan's wishes to appease the Legion, despite having the industry censor's approval. In 1952, a judge overturned the mutual decision of 1915, granting films First Amendment protections, which made it much more difficult for state and local censorship boards to edit films. And while the decision didn't strip the PCA of its power to enforce the code, there was a feeling of a turning tide in the industry. In 1954, Joseph Breen would step down as head of the PCA after more than 20 years, but not before accepting an honorary Oscar for his, quote, open-minded and dignified management of the PCA. His successor, Jeffrey Sherlock, would prove a much more lenient enforcer of the code, whose concessions would bring the code to the breaking point. In 1954, the same year Joseph Breen retired as head of the PCA, Will Hayes passed away. With new leadership atop both the PCA and the Producers Association for the first time since code enforcement took effect 20 years prior, an era of change was upon the industry. 1956 code amendments removed depictions of drug addiction, childbirth, and prostitution from the list of unacceptable material. The nation's other strong arm of morality enforcement, the Legion of Decency, softened its message as well, as the 50s gave way to the more liberal 1960s. As a stepping stone between the production code and the rating system we have now, some movies released in the 1960s would be forced to brand their advertising materials as being for adults only. This was the case of Stanley Kubrick's Lolita, which received code approval for its 1962 release. The Legion of Decency promised to withhold the condemned rating so long as theaters refused anyone younger than 18 years old. The studio exhibiting Lolita took advantage of this demand with a marketing stunt, photographing the film's star, 15-year-old Sue Lyon, locked outside of the theater during its premiere. The MPAA long considered changes to the code following its release, but was without a president for 3 years following Eric Johnston's death in 1963. Jack Valenti, an advisor to LBJ, was elected in 1966, just as Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was seeking approval. The film was saturated with obscenities and vulgarities that clearly violated the code as written, though Valenti would see the film received approval through the established appeals process and released with a mature audience-only label. And while the rating system was being worked out, the mature audience tag was issued to more than half of all studio releases in 1967, showing that filmmakers were eager to explore more adult themes on screen. The rating system was implemented in 1968 and has seen only minor tweaks since. Though some filmmakers initially saw the rating system nearly as restrictive as the code itself, as studios still worked with the newly named Code and Rating Administration to receive their desired rating, moving away from the code to a rating system helped ensure the end of censorship in Hollywood and led to countless subjects being filmed in the United States for the very first time. Despite code restrictions on what could be shown on screen, or perhaps because of the imaginative ways creatives tried to subvert it, much of the code era is referred to as the Golden Age of Hollywood and is considered the most lucrative and creative years of the industry's history.